Imagine planting a simple vegetable garden in your backyard, only to have your HOA president declare it a threat to the neighborhood. First, they hit me with fines. Then, they tried to ban my tomatoes. And just when I thought it couldn't get worse, they called the cops on my zucchini. Yes, you heard that right. Buckle up, because this is the story of how I went to war with my HOA over nothing but a few vegetables and won. It's a sunny Saturday morning, and I'm covered in dirt, grinning like a kid on Christmas. I've got soil under my nails, sweat on my brow, and I couldn't be happier. Why? Because I'm finally living my dream of having my very own garden. For years, I dreamed of this moment. Our old place only had a tiny balcony barely big enough for a potted plant. But now, with our new house, I finally had the space to make my green thumb dreams come true. I spent weeks planning it out, poring over gardening books, and watching countless YouTube videos. I was determined to do this right. My wife thought I was nuts for spending so much time out there, but he couldn't argue with the fresh veggies I started bringing to the dinner table. Every morning, I'd wake up early just to spend a few minutes in my little slice of paradise. The vibrant colors, the sweet smell of flowers, the earthy scent of tomato plants, it was pure bliss. I'd run my fingers through the soft soil, feeling connected to something bigger than myself. But then one day, I noticed a shadow at the edge of my garden. At first, I thought maybe it was someone admiring from afar, so I waved and smiled, ready to show off my pride and joy. As I got closer, I saw a tall woman with perfectly coiffed hair that didn't move an inch in the breeze. Her clothes looked expensive, and the look on her face anything but friendly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Are you aware that this mess is a violation of our HOA rules?" I blinked, caught off guard. HOA rules? I vaguely remembered signing some papers when we bought the house, but hadn't given them much thought. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to keep my voice friendly. "I'm not sure what you mean. This is just my garden." She let out a dramatic sigh. "This is not a garden," she said, gesturing at my beautiful plants. "This is an eyesore. It's bringing down property values in the entire neighborhood." I felt my face getting hot. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand," I said, my voice a little less friendly now. "My garden is well maintained." She cut me off. "I am Eleanor Deo, president of the Homeowners Association, and I'm telling you this simply won't do. You have 1 week to remove all of this and replace it with proper landscaping, or you'll be hearing from our lawyers." With that, she turned on her heel and marched away, leaving me standing there with my mouth hanging open in shock. I looked back at my garden, beautiful, thriving garden, and felt a knot form in my stomach. This couldn't be happening, not to my little piece of heaven. I thought that would be the end of it, just some busybody with nothing better to do than hassle her neighbors. Boy, was I wrong. The next day, I woke up to find a bright orange sticker slapped on my mailbox. "Violation!" it screamed in bold letters. What could I possibly done now? As I stood there with a coffee mug in hand and still in my pajamas, I heard the click-clack of high heels on the sidewalk. I turned to see Eleanor Deo striding towards me, clipboard in hand, and a look of determination on her face that would make a drill sergeant proud. "Mrs. Carter," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, "I hope you've had time to consider our conversation from yesterday." I blinked, still half asleep. "Conversation? You mean when you told me my garden was against the rules?" Eleanor's smile tightened. "Precisely. Now I've taken the liberty of drafting up an official notice for you." She thrust a piece of paper into my hands. I scanned the document, my eyes widening with each ridiculous line. My garden violated 3 HOA bylaws: unapproved landscape alteration, failing to maintain aesthetic harmony, and encouraging wildlife intrusion. "Wildlife intrusion?" I sputtered. "It's a vegetable garden, not a petting zoo. What's next? Fining people for bird feeders because they're running an unauthorized avian resort?" Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Vegetables attract rabbits, Mrs. Carter. Do you want to be responsible for a rabbit infestation in our community? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Listen, Eleanor, I've lived here for 5 years. I've never heard of these before. Can you show me where it says I can't have a vegetable garden? She clutched her clipboard to her chest. The bylaws clearly state that all landscaping changes must be approved by the HOA board. Did you submit a request form? I hadn't, of course. No, I admitted. But then, you're in violation. Eleanor cut me off. You have 7 days to remove the garden and restore your yard, or you'll face daily fines starting at $50. My jaw dropped. Daily fines for growing vegetables? As Eleanor click-clacked away, I stood there holding that stupid piece of paper, wondering how my little garden could cause so much trouble. I looked back at my thriving plants. The thought of tearing it all out made my heart ache. Don't let her push you around, Sarah. I turned to see my neighbor Tom watering his lawn. That garden of yours is the best thing on the block. We've got your back. His words gave me strength. I wasn't about to give up without a fight. If Eleanor wanted a war over veggies, she was going to get one. I stormed back into the house, fired up my computer, and started digging into those HOA bylaws. There had to be a loophole, something I could use to save my garden. I thought I'd seen the worst of Eleanor's antics, but boy was I wrong. The next week felt like I was living in some bizarre gardening reality show. Eleanor seemed to materialize out of thin air every time I stepped outside, iPhone in hand, snapping pictures like she was documenting evidence for a crime scene. One sunny afternoon, while I was pruning my cucumber vines, I noticed a flash of movement near the fence. I peeked over and nearly fell over. Laughing there was Eleanor, ruler in hand, stretching up on her tiptoes to measure my cherry tomato plants. I couldn't help myself. Need some fertilizer for your ruler garden, Eleanor? I called out. She jumped like a startled cat and scurried away without a word. But Eleanor wasn't done. A few days later, I came home to find my neighbors clutching glossy pamphlets. Eleanor had gone full door-to-door saleswoman, handing out garden violation awareness flyers. These masterpieces featured a photo of my garden with a big red X through it, alongside pictures of perfectly manicured lawns. The text warned about the dangerous precedent my veggie patch was setting. I had to admit, I was almost impressed by her dedication. Things took a turn for the truly bizarre when Eleanor set her sights on my sunflowers. Those sunflowers are a threat to property values, she shrieked from her driveway. They're too tall. They're blocking the view. I looked around, puzzled. The only thing those sunflowers were blocking was Eleanor's view of my tomatoes, which she seemed unnaturally obsessed with. I tried reasoning with her one morning when I caught her power walking past my house and decided to extend an olive branch. Eleanor, I said, jogging to catch up with her, did you know that gardens can actually increase property values? Studies show they can boost home prices by up to 70%. She didn't even break her stride, just huffed and puffed away like I was invisible. Just when I thought things couldn't get any weirder, Eleanor outdid herself. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon. I was in the backyard harvesting when I heard sirens. I peeked around the side of the house and saw a patrol car pulling up. Eleanor was there, pointing dramatically at my garden like she was reenacting a scene from a bad cop show. 2 officers approached, looking confused. Ma'am, one of them said, trying to keep a straight face, we received a call about suspicious plants. I burst out laughing. Officers, I managed to say between giggles, would you like a tour of my criminal vegetable empire? The younger cop cracked a smile and turned to Eleanor. Ma'am, can you point out exactly which plants you believe are? Eleanor sputtered and pointed at my zucchini plants. They're too big to be legal vegetables. The officers exchanged glances, clearly struggling not to laugh. The older cop cleared his throat. Ma'am, I can assure you there's no law against large zucchini. As they were leaving, the younger officer paused. Say, those tomatoes look mighty fine. Any chance you might spare one for a hard-working public servant? I happily obliged, sending them off with a bag of veggies. Eleanor stood there, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water as the patrol car drove away. You think having the police laugh off her complaints would make Eleanor rethink her anti-garden vendetta? Fat chance. As I watched her storm back to her house, I had no idea of the sneaky, underhanded tactics she was about to unleash. Let's just say my security camera was about to earn its keep. The next morning, I woke up to find a stack of flyers on my porch. "Attention neighbors, pest infestation alert." The headline screamed in big red letters. Eleanor's expert analysis claimed my garden was a breeding ground for every bug imaginable, including made-up ones like zucchini weevils. Over the next few days, my front door became a bulletin board for Eleanor's passive-aggressive notes. "Your weeds are showing," one said. Another informed me that my tomatoes were visually disruptive due to their excessive redness. Things got even crazier when Eleanor tried to claim my garden was a structure needing HOA approval. I received a formal letter stating my vegetable-based edit violated building codes. Was she seriously arguing my tomato plants needed a building permit? One afternoon, I caught Eleanor red-handed, sprinkling weed killer in my garden beds. I confronted her, and she tried to pass it off as fertilizer. I grabbed the bottle and threatened to call the police if she came near my garden again. That's when I installed the security camera. Over the next week, it caught Eleanor in more sneaky acts than a spy movie. She'd wait until I left for work, then come snooping around with a ruler and notebook. One day, she spent an hour measuring my sunflowers, probably hoping they'd grown an illegal inch overnight. But Eleanor's crusade hit its peak when she tried to get my mail delivery stopped, claiming my plants were obstructing the path to my mailbox. I was chatting with Mike, our mailman, when he mentioned her complaint. "You know," Mike said, shaking his head. "In all my years on this route, I've never seen anyone go to such lengths over a few tomato plants. What's her deal anyway?" I shrugged. "Honestly, Mike, I'm starting to wonder if Eleanor has some kind of personal vendetta against vegetables. Maybe she got scared by a cucumber as a child or something." As amusing as it was to joke about Eleanor's vegetable vendetta, the constant harassment was starting to wear on me. There were days when I wanted nothing more than to march over to her perfectly manicured lawn and give her a piece of my mind. But I knew that was exactly what she wanted to see me lose my cool and prove that I was the neighborhood menace she claimed I was. Instead, I decided to take the high road. Every time Eleanor glared at me from across the street, I'd plaster on my brightest smile and wave like we were long-lost friends. The look of confusion on her face was priceless. When she left another one of her ridiculous violation notices on my door, I'd respond with a cheerful thank you card. "Dear Eleanor, thanks so much for your concern about my garden. The zucchini are coming in nicely. Some?" I even started inviting her over for tea and cucumber sandwiches fresh from the garden. I'd call out as she'd walked past my house. She never accepted, of course, but I could tell it was driving her nuts. How could she keep painting me as the neighborhood villain when I was being so darn nice? One afternoon, I was out watering my tomatoes when I saw Eleanor on her phone, gesturing wildly towards my yard. Sure enough, about 20 minutes later, a police car pulled up. I had to bite my cheek to keep from laughing as I watched Eleanor practically drag the poor officer over to my criminal garden. "Officer," I said with a big smile, "would you like a tour of the crime scene? I promise there are no zucchini weevils in sight." The cop looked confused, but played along as we walked through the rows of vegetables. I couldn't help but notice him eyeing my cherry tomatoes. "Those are delicious," he said almost sheepishly. "Please take some," I insisted, handing him a paper bag. "I've got more than I know what to do with." As he left with his bag of evidence, I caught Eleanor's eye. If looks could kill, I'd have been fertilizer next year's crop. To be honest, keeping my cool wasn't always easy. There were nights when I'd lie awake, my stomach in knots, replaying Eleanor's latest stunt in my head. But then I'd remind myself that getting angry would only give her more ammunition. Plus, there was something oddly satisfying about killing her with. I even started having a little fun with it. Remember that gnarly tomato plant that looked like it had been through a war? I named it Eleanor. Every time I watered it, I'd say, "Looking lovely today, Eleanor," loud enough for the real Eleanor to hear if she happened to be lurking nearby. Through it all, I kept gardening. I wasn't about to let Eleanor's crusade ruin something I loved so much. If anything, her antics made me even more. I planted more flowers, experimented with new vegetables, and spent every spare moment tending to my little slice of paradise. Eleanor's persistence was like a stubborn weed. The more you tried to get rid of it, the stronger it seemed to grow. But so was my resolve. The best part? My garden was thriving despite Eleanor's dire warnings about pest infestations and property value plummets. My yard had never looked better. The sunflowers were taller than ever, the zucchinis were still comically large, and I swear my tomatoes were sir. While my garden was thriving, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. Eleanor's crusade against my veggies seemed a little too personal, too made up. I decided it was time to dig into the real dirt, the HOA rulebook. Getting my hands on that thing was no easy task. After days of sweet-talking Marge at the community center, she finally caved. When she handed it over, I nearly toppled backwards. This rulebook was thicker than my grandma's old family Bible and about as exciting as watching paint dry. But I was on a mission. Night after night, I pored over that monster armed with a highlighter and more coffee than any human should. My wife thought I'd lost it. "Honey," he'd say, peeking into our home office at 2 a.m. "You know normal people are sleeping right now, right?" I'd just grunt and keep flipping pages. You wouldn't believe the stuff I found in the rules about everything from the acceptable height of your fence, down to the 1/4 inch, to the exact shade of beige your mailbox had to be. You bet there was even a section on what kind of Christmas lights you could use. Spoiler alert. No blinking allowed, sorry, Griswolds. But here's the kicker. Not a single word about vegetable garden, one measly mention. I read that thing cover to cover, then backwards, then upside down, just in case. Nada. Zip. Zilch. In fact, there was a whole section encouraging beautification of personal property. It went on about how homeowners should enhance the visual appeal of their yards. Last I checked, my zucchinis were a lot prettier than Eleanor's wilting petunias. I couldn't believe it. I called my buddy Jake, who happens to be a lawyer. He came over, read through the rulebook, and confirmed, "Emily, there's absolutely nothing in here about vegetable gardens being against the rules. Your HOA president's been taking you for a ride." I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. All this time, all that stress, all those confrontations in Eleanor had been making up rules. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so I did both, probably looking like a complete lunatic to poor Jake. Once the shock wore off, I realized what this meant. I had ammunition, now real solid proof, that Eleanor was full of hot air. It was time to plan my counterattack. I spent the next few days strategizing. Should I confront Eleanor directly or go bigger and expose her lies to the whole neighborhood? In the end, I decided to play it cool. I'd wait for the next HOA meeting and drop my bombshell there, let Eleanor dig her own grave in front of everyone. As I plotted my move, I couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all. I was planning a takedown over some tomatoes and zucchini. But it wasn't about the veggies anymore. It was about standing up to a bully, about fighting for what's right. And boy, was I ready for a fight. Just when I thought this whole garden fiasco couldn't get any crazier, the plot thickened faster than my grandma's famous gravy. My little vegetable patch had become a symbol of something bigger, and I wasn't the only one who felt that way. The next few days gave Neighborhood Watch a whole new meaning. It started with Mrs. Johnson from next door bringing a steaming apple pie and support for my tomatoes. Then the floodgates opened. The Smiths offered to be witnesses against Eleanor's yard skulking. Even grumpy Mr. Peterson grumbled that he'd rather look at my garden than Eleanor's sour face. Soon, I was finding encouraging notes in my mailbox. "Keep growing, and don't let the HOA get you down." One neighbor, a retired lawyer, wrote a passionate defense of my garden as a clear victory for common sense and human decency. The support bloomed like a well-tended garden. I woke up one morning to find kids putting up a colorful sign. "Save the tomatoes." They cheered like I was some veggie-growing superhero. Eleanor, driving by later, looked like she'd swallowed a particularly sour lemon. Word spread beyond our cul-de-sac. The local garden club offered to inspect my yard and write a formal letter of approval. I couldn't help but grin, imagining Eleanor's face if a bunch of master gardeners showed up to defend my zucchinis. As my team of supporters grew, we started to strategize. We gathered in my backyard, surrounded by the contentious veggies, to plan our next moves. Mrs. Johnson suggested a neighborhood potluck featuring dishes made from homegrown produce. The Smiths proposed documenting Eleanor's investigations to build a case against harassment. Mr. Peterson, in a rare moment of enthusiasm, declared he'd start his own garden in solidarity. "Let's see her try to take on the whole street," he said with a glimmer in his eye. As we sat there, surrounded by thriving plants and determined neighbors, I realized something important. This wasn't just about my garden anymore. It wasn't even about Eleanor and her crusade. It was about standing up to unfair rules and refusing to let someone bully into submission. My little vegetable patch had sprouted into a full-blown rebellion, with roots spreading through the entire neighborhood. The garden uprising of Maple Street was in full bloom, and I couldn't wait to see what would grow next. People I'd barely spoken to before were now stopping by to chat about my garden or offer advice with Eleanor. It felt amazing, like I was part of some secret resistance movement against the tyranny of overzealous HOA enforcement. The day of the HOA meeting was looming, and I knew I had to bring my A-game. This wasn't just about my garden anymore. It was about standing up to unfair rules and showing Eleanor that she couldn't bully us into submission. Determined to make my case, I decided to create a PowerPoint presentation. I spent hours putting together slides with before and after photos of my garden, including shots of my giant zucchini. I highlighted every relevant section in the HOA rulebook, turning it into a rainbow-colored mess. Mrs. Johnson agreed to speak on my behalf and promised to bring one of her famous apples. I also created a photo album of my veggies titled Exhibit A, The Crimes of the Carter Garden, with captions like Dangerous Tomato, Approach with Caution, and Lethal Lettuce. Not for the faint of heart. The night before the big showdown, I practiced my speech in front of Mr. Whiskers, my cat. He seemed unimpressed, but I kept going, trying to anticipate Eleanor's arguments. As I rehearsed, my hands got sweaty and my voice shaky. I imagined worst-case scenarios. Tripping over my own feet as I walked in, my PowerPoint slides mysteriously disappearing, or Eleanor show up with an army of lawyers. I tossed and turned all night, my mind racing. What if Eleanor had some trick up her sleeve? What if the other HOA members were with her? I pictured myself stuttering through my presentation while Eleanor smirked triumphantly. Or worse, what if I got so nervous I accidentally called her Your Majesty instead of Madam President? But every time doubt crept in, I reminded myself why I was doing this. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all of us, the neighbors who supported me, the kids who'd made that adorable Save the Tomato sign, even old Mr. Peterson, who'd actually cracked a smile when I gave him some fresh cucumbers. As I lay there staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. Here I was, losing sleep over a bunch of tomato plants and zucchinis. But you know what? It felt good. It felt right. I was standing up for something I believed in, even if that something was just my little backyard garden. And come tomorrow, win or lose, I was going to give it everything I had. As I walked into the community center, my heart was pounding like crazy. The room was packed, and the air buzzed with tension. I could smell coffee and hear the rustle of papers as people settled in their seats. This wasn't just a meeting anymore. It was the main event, and everyone had come to see the showdown. I took a deep breath and thought, well, Emily, you wanted to make a difference. Let's see if you can put your money where your mouth is. Eleanor strutted in like she owned the place, her nose so high in the air I thought she might trip over her own feet. She sat down in the front row, arms crossed, looking ready to breathe fire. I remembered her first complaint about my garden, how she'd sniffed at my tomato plants and called them unsightly. Now she was out for blood. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up and cleared my throat. Eleanor tried to interrupt, but the room shut her down. "Let her speak," someone shouted. Mrs. Johnson, clutching her famous apple pie, nodded encouragingly. I started my presentation, showing photos of my garden and quoting the HOA rules. People actually applauded. Alex and Priya, the young couple from down the street, gave me thumbs up. I even heard a few oohs and ahs when I showed off my prize tomatoes. Eleanor's face got redder with each slide. Just when I thought I was home free, Eleanor jumped up, waving a piece of paper like it was the Holy Grail. "I have here," she announced in a shrill voice, "a new rule about gardens that was just approved by the board." The room erupted into chaos. "You can't do that," yelled Mike, our mailman. In the middle of the mayhem, Mr. Peterson, the grumpiest old man in the neighborhood, stood up, and the room went quiet. "I move," he said in his gravelly voice, "to remove Eleanor from the board." Eleanor's jaw dropped so far I thought it might hit the floor. She sputtered and stammered, trying to find words, but for once in her life, she was speechless. As we waited for the vote, I realized this meeting had turned into something much bigger than my garden. It wasn't just about tomatoes and zucchini anymore. It was about fairness, about community, about standing up to bullies who hide books and regulations. The board members huddled together, whispering furiously. Eleanor kept trying to butt in, but they waved her away like she was an annoying fly. Finally, the board president stood up, looking a bit shell-shocked. "We'll be taking a vote on Mr. Peterson's motion," he announced. "All in favor of removing Eleanor Deo from the HOA board, please raise your hand." I held my breath as hands shot up all around the room. It was like watching a wave at a football game, except instead of cheering for touchdowns, we were cheering for the right to grow vegetables without being harassed. The vote was unanimous. Eleanor was out, and my garden was safe. This battle started over tomatoes and zucchini, but it ended with something much bigger in neighborhood finally standing up to an overzealous HOA. Eleanor thought she could bully us with made-up rules, but in the end, she was the one getting voted out. And as for me, my garden is still thriving. My sunflowers are standing tall. And yes, my zucchini are still comically large. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment what's the most ridiculous thing your HOA has ever done. I'd love to hear your stories.